Welcome back to the Impact Driven Leader podcast. This is your host, Tyler Dickerhoof. Glad that you're here today. If you're watching on YouTube, good to see you. Summer color, it's all in full tilt. If you're watching, listening, wherever you're listening, man, excited that you're tuning in. Excited that you're a subscriber. If someone shared this with you, amazing, awesome. I'm excited today to share this conversation with Henna Pryor. Henna is the queen of awkward. All right, I gave her that title. I'll find out if she approves or not. We'll get back to that. She's the author of a book coming out this fall, Good Awkward, as well. She's a speaker within the Limitless Minds cadre. She has a group called the Priority Group. She's a keynote speaker, works with organizations, really working, centering around this idea of awkward. She does so much more beyond that. But the conversation we have today is much about awkward. You know, as Henna and I were sharing this conversation, I knew it would be great. And it was more than I imagined. See, we have a mutual connection. We've kind of wandered around, said hi to each other in the social media hallways the last couple of years. Colin Henderson is our mutual friend. And I'm excited for this conversation for several different reasons. But we get close to the heart of this awkward when I ask Henna a question right towards the end. And she was able to fight back tears, deliver such an amazing response that, quite honestly, I could relate to in my own little way, and you probably can too. See, people, and of course leaders, do a disservice to themselves and others when they avoid or shun awkward. You'll hear about those early start for Henna, but I also know this. We're all awkward, and that's okay. So I'm excited for you to listen to this conversation. One reminder, if you're not a subscriber to the Impact Driven Leader podcast, do yourself a favor, tap on the subscribe button so that way new episodes get uploaded into your library each week when they release on Friday. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'd love for you to hit subscribe as well. That way you get these episodes, but I also release a live recording every Monday through Friday where I shared a little bit more about the content of these podcasts, go a little bit deeper on my own, but also whatever I'm learning in the moment. That's part of my coffee chat, but now it's morphed into being more and more deeper conversations about these podcasts. Excited for you to listen to this episode. I'll catch up with you at the end. We'll wrap everything up, share a few high moments, and get you off and on your way. Henna, I'm excited to finally chat with you. We've interacted a little bit here and there. We have numerous mutual friends. One of them, Colin Henderson, good friend, previous guest on this podcast. And man, I'm excited to have a conversation with you and talk about your world, your sphere of, really serving people through speaking, through writing a new book coming out, and really helping leaders. That's what I see you doing, trying to do every day in the workplace and help leaders just kind of get past their awkwardness and goofiness and realize that's them.
Yes, I am excited for this conversation. I feel like we've been circling kind of like sharks on social media for a while. So it's cool to actually get to be in conversation with you. So let's do it.
Yeah. So start off kind of, where did this idea of awkwardness and realizing, this is something we need to talk about rather than just kind of squash and avoid and get past, where did that really come to the surface for you?
Yeah. So, okay. Beyond going into my origin story, I'll tell you where something set it off. My whole life, first generation parents are immigrants to the United States, so I was always one of the onlys in the room. I always felt like I didn't quite belong. I was always eating food that smelled different. I was dressing different. So, my whole childhood story is one of not feeling like everybody else was like me, and that there was always something a little bit off, a little bit awkward, a little bit different. I felt quite nerdy. I don't want to say I was quite nerdy. There was a lot there that, was origin driven. But I'll tell you that the professional interest in awkwardness really began in and following I don't want to say the end of the pandemic, because as of today, we're still in it. But, when it started to wind down, I remembered listening to so many podcasts, especially by Queen Brené Brown. She would end things by saying, stay awkward, brave, and kind. That was a phrase that she used often. Stay awkward, brave, and kind. And I always really latched on to this. God, just life feels so awkward at every transition point, at every inflection point. When I was a child and was entering a new school, that was awkward. When I was changing grades, that was awkward. When I was growing taller than all of the boys in my class and all of a sudden was, 8 inches taller than them, that was awkward. And then when I started my first job, when I started my next job, And she kept saying that, and it was so resonant. And then I kind of had this moment of, there's this emotion that we all feel, that we all experience, but I need to know more about it. I need to understand it. You're telling me to stay awkward, brave, and kind. The brave and kind part I got. I know what that looks like. How do I stay awkward? It doesn't feel good. I don't like it. Why don't I like it? Why can't I do what she's asking me to do? And it sort of started this whole deep dive into the emotion and the universality of it, and how we really don't understand it as deeply as we could. And that's what led to the curiosity.
So what freedom have you gained from embracing awkwardness?
I think a lot of times in the leadership spheres, especially, the prevailing phrase is overcome the awkwardness, right? How do we eliminate awkwardness? How do we overcome awkwardness? And the truth is, in the research, I spent the last 2 years in the research, you can't eliminate awkwardness, because eliminating awkwardness implies eliminating uncertainty. It implies having no unplanned events ever happen in life. Part of living as a human being on this earth is things are going to happen that you don't expect. And every time you try to take a risk, anytime you're at an inflection point, you are increasing the likelihood that something might happen in the way you don't expect. And so just before I tell you how embracing it matters, I'll just give a quick definition.
Sure.
Awkwardness in the spheres that we're talking about it is what someone feels when the person they believe themselves to be, so their true self, in a moment is at odds. There's a gap between the person we believe ourselves to be and then the person who for that moment is on display, a person that other people see. So for example, I'm walking down the street. I think I'm generally someone who knows how to walk down the street. I trip over a crack in the sidewalk, and this person walking by me is like, this idiot who doesn't know how to walk, right? We feel awkward. We feel embarrassed. We feel a twinge because for a moment, albeit temporary, the person we believe ourselves to be is at odds, right? Same thing when we say the wrong thing and we're like, oh, awkward, right? That wasn't what that person expected me to say, or they're saying something I didn't. This is when we feel it. Embracing it is truly the key to being able to do anything in life that involves even a percentage of risk, because anytime you put yourself in a situation where growth is on the table, you are inviting that. And so we have to start to welcome it in rather than trying to eliminate it. It's not going to happen if we're going to grow.
So as you described that, and as I shared with you as we were getting ready, one of the areas that I've tried to focus the most on is insecurity. And, the barrier of insecurity and how people, put masks around it. Like you said, if we try to overcome our awkwardness, to me, what that's saying is I'm ashamed of my awkwardness, where that becomes then an insecurity, where I try to avoid any situation that could be awkward. Or if there's awkward, I go run and hide.
Yeah.
So share kind of like your perspective on where awkwardness and insecurities and the fear of awkwardness and insecurities and how that affects people.
Yeah, they are 100% tied in this conversation. So you used a key word that came up a lot in the book, which is avoidance, right? So awkwardness, again, there's two places where we experience it. In life's unplanned moments, right? I tripped over the sidewalk. I didn't exactly plan on that, right? That was just one of those things that happened. But then we also experience it in life's planned moments. I raised my hand in the meeting, tried to come up with this idea. The leader looked at me like, have you lost your mind? Like, no, that's a stupid idea, right? That was a planned moment, but it was a moment where I took a risk, micro risk, macro risk, and an awkwardness resulted. So it can come from either of those scenarios. Now, insecurity stems from a pattern of conditioning that comes with experiencing awkwardness. It can come from a variety of places, but often if we were in rooms growing up where we said the dumb thing and our caregiver or the kids in our class was like, you dummy, why would you say such a dumb thing? As kids, our adolescent brains are absorbing that information. We're absorbing that need for external approval and saying, I don't like the way that awkwardness made me feel. The person that they saw on display, that person's a dummy. I don't want them to see that person again. So the word you used, avoidance, kicks in. We're going to avoid situations that might make us feel that way again. Awkwardness is an emotion of discomfort. No one will claim, despite my rally cry to embrace it, it is not a comfortable emotion. We'd rather avoid it. Our body's natural instinct is to avoid it. But when it happens over and over, slowly that accumulates and it turns into I am that person that other people see on display. We become conditioned to believe that which over time becomes an insecurity that becomes very difficult for people to overcome, and they avoid instead of embrace.
All right, in the middle of this conversation, I just want to take a moment to invite you, if you're not a subscriber to the Impact Driven Leader newsletter, to go to the Impact Driven Leader /free course. You're going to get the 4 days to maximum impact video series as well. Submit you into my email sphere where you can learn more about the Impact Driven Leader community. So now back to the rest of the episode. I have a friend, he does tremendous work with a youth organization. It's called Driven, Roy Hall. And one of the things that he talks about is failure. And failure is an event, not a person.
Yeah.
And why I shared that is because all of a sudden it hit me. If we embrace awkwardness as an event rather than as a person, we can disassociate our fears, our insecurities with awkwardness to understand that's just me. Fine, whatever. It doesn't define me, maybe in that instance, or maybe in just that doesn't matter to me. So maybe awkward to you, but I'm okay with it. And actually my genius comes from that. But to me, as I'm fleshing this out, as I'm thinking about it, man, that takes a lot of change to embrace that.
Yeah, it takes a lot of change, and it takes a lot of intentional self-reflection. So, I'll paraphrase what you just said. Awkwardness, sometimes people experience it as a state. I feel awkward right now. A lot of times people will use it as language, as a trait, right? I am awkward. I am socially awkward. This is who I am. And so we all know language is powerful. I'm sure that's not the first time that's come up in your podcast, right? Like, language is powerful. The words we use to describe ourselves. Are you awkward? Or are you prone to awkward moments? Do you experience a lot of awkward moments? And by definition, not Henna definition, by Webster and Merriam-Webster dictionary definition, awkwardness is subjective. There is no such thing as a person or a situation that is factually awkward. It is up to us to deem it so. And so, when we use language like I am socially awkward, that is an opinion. That is either an opinion you've made of yourself or you've allowed someone to make of you, but it is not a statement of fact. And so if we can start from that place, a lot of the work, Colin and I do at Limitless Minds is talking about getting to truth, getting to evidence, getting to what is true, what's neutral. When you get back to statements of fact, then you can say something like, yeah, that was a pretty cringy, embarrassing, awkward situation, but you have to own the fact that you're, deeming yourself that way. It's a subjective opinion that you've, created for yourself.
One of the things that I think, again, along this work of insecurity, you bring up Brene Brown, who's been so good at identifying vulnerability as a trait to embrace, right? And how we get to vulnerability, and as we discuss awkwardness here, and just getting beyond ourselves. And if we can appreciate that, then all of a sudden the tension probably in relationships and interactions can actually diffuse. To me, there's nothing worse than someone who is like, whether they're fighting awkwardness where they don't want to embrace it, and so they retract from situations. You're like, no, I need more of you. I need you to be involved here. But you're so afraid of being awkward that all of a sudden now it's off-putting, where you aren't willing to be authentic, where it's almost like you're this enigma that we can't figure out because everything stays kind of within these guidelines to where I can control it. Because if I get outside of that, my awkwardness, where I'm just different, may show up, and people are going to, judge me by that instead of saying it doesn't matter.
Yeah. I love how perceptive you are around this. What I would say to that is, first, the avoidance of awkward increases awkward. We've all been in those situations where an awkward moment happens, people try to avoid it, and you're like, well, this just made it worse, right? Like, this is not helpful.
This
so
is
interesting. Interestingly, running towards it, naming it, this is awkward. Whoa, that was awkward, right? It actually diffuses the tension from it. So the avoidance of it increases it. I love that you kind of picked up on the connection between awkwardness and vulnerability. So the way I distinguish between the two is vulnerability requires a higher level of emotional exposure, right? Both of them speak to a very closely related discomfort of an emotion depending on your, comfort level with it. But awkwardness by definition is a little lower on the scale of emotional exposure. So the way I describe it in the book is embracing awkwardness is a absolutely non-negotiable stepping stone to embracing true, authentic vulnerability. Because if you're not able to allow others to see your small, stumbly, fumbly missteps, true vulnerability is not within reach. And too many leaders have been taught now, vulnerability is a superpower, vulnerability is a superpower. So, and then some of them do it beautifully, right? I know these people, you know these people. They're beautiful at demonstrating authentic, true, rich vulnerability. And then we've got the other camp who's like, well, we got to do layoffs, and I'm so sorry. This is real hard for everybody, including me, who's still keeping my $30 million bonus. And we're like, it's not hard for you, buddy. Like, it's not hard for you at all. This is,
I think it also then it goes along the line of toxic authenticity.
Yes.
I'm going to be in that case, that's
right.
Toxic. Like, come on, dude. Like, no,
yeah.
that isn't helping anyone. It's an awkward situation. It's like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be here. I don't want to have this happen.
I don't want to say this. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's that fine line. And to me, the disingenuous, which I would come back to the ones that are so afraid of being awkward or deemed awkward, are the ones that end up being most inauthentic. Because they're still so concerned about what other people are thinking, instead of saying, I walk out the door and guess what? I have toilet paper that's on my shoe. Whatever. It happens, right?
Right.
It happens to people, and just embracing it, where, you do your laundry and then all of a sudden a sock falls out of your shirt as you're in the midst of you doing those things happen. And instead of realizing that's real life, we try to get to this point of like, oh, I have to airbrush it all. And if I airbrush it all so it looks perfect, then people are going to think the absolute best of me. And
right.
I think too often people put on that image of that's the person we need to be. In our society, I believe, is quickly figuring out, especially younger generations are quickly figuring out, I can't trust that person.
No, because it's not possible. It is not possible. According to Instagram, I have a tiny little nose with no pores on it, right? Like, it is not possible. None of these things are possible. And it's interesting. One of the interviews I did for the book was a woman who's a senior leader at a telecom company. And she said, leading up to the pandemic, her CEO was really perceived by the company as this very stiff, stodgy, unrelatable corporate type. And, when the pandemic hit, we all of a sudden, nobody had time to curate their Zoom background. We were just in it all of a sudden. And she said her CEO would come on these virtual town halls. The dog was barking. The kids were pulling on his sleeve and he was flustered. She said, everyone loved it. Everyone loved it because for the first time, this CEO showed the company his humanity, and he hadn't shown it in years. And so he learned the lessons of that time, and he stopped wearing a suit on every single call. He started relaxing his language. And so, what you're describing is actually corroborated by the research. There's research that says when you let a bit of your awkwardness show, whether it's planned or unplanned, people actually view you as more trustworthy, more generous, more kind. And the reason is exactly what you've just described, because your lack of perfection puts other people at ease. And you want that from your team. You want them to be at ease, not like this around you all the time.
Well, I think there's also this element where we start to figure out, especially in the comparison world, social media, whatever it may be, that if that's what it takes, I will never be able to, because I'm not that perfect.
Right.
If it takes, if you look at your ability to speak on stage, and if that's what it takes, well, then I could never do it. Instead of saying, you look at the hundreds and thousands of TEDx talks. You've done 2. There's people that have done 1. There's people that have done more. The variety and ability in speakership is dramatic. Yes. And, I had a friend that shared this with me, and I think I'd love to hear it from your profession as a professional speaker, being on stages all the time, that audiences don't want that perfect, polished speaker as much as they want the real speaker, the person that maybe fumbles, the person's like, oh, wait a second, where was I? The person that is willing to say, that doesn't matter. Let me just talk to you, young lady in the audience, because you're the person I really care about. To me, as I've seen, that's what people want. They don't want the perfect performer that everything is perfect. Their hair is always in the perfect spot. The mic, it's all perfect, because that's not the world we live in. It's not relatable.
So my answer to this question might surprise you, because I don't think it's as easy as it's a yes and on that one.
Okay.
Yes, universally, people want to see an authentic, connected human on stage. They don't just want a straight up canned performance. No one connects to that. So 100% yes. I think part of authenticity and embracing the awkward on stage is understanding that if somebody sneezes or if somebody whatever, that you need to be agile in the moment of, man, your sneeze just made me forget what I was going to say, right? Like awkward, but that's the truth. Now, that said, I think there is a danger, and this is the and part of this, of people, and I've seen this too often, and I talk about this in my keynotes about this. I've heard people say to me, I don't rehearse because I find rehearsing, I don't role play with my teams because I find role playing awkward. It makes me nervous. I don't like it. And that, in my opinion, is not how this works. That is a form of self-handicapping where we think, okay, if I don't rehearse, if I don't practice, then if it doesn't go well, I can blame that. And I don't have to worry if I'm not any good at it, that people are going to think less of me. So it's a both end. I think professional speakers do have to prepare like hell. They absolutely should rehearse like hell. They absolutely should know their material. But part of embracing the awkward and connecting with your audience is knowing that humans are going to human, because that's what you have in the audience. And that when you can fall off and get back on the horse, the better you know your material, the easier it is to be authentic in that moment. So it's both.
Well, I think that last point is the leadership point, is know your material, know your people, know it so well that you don't feel like I have to memorize it or I have no value. No different if we're sitting here, I'm giving, you go back to the CEO where he's giving a state of the union for the organization, is if you're coming in and you're reading this scripted, this is what we are, people are going to quickly figure out, it's like, does this guy even know what's going on? Does he even care about us? But if he knows the business so well, he understands so well where it's going, he knows his people so well, he goes, I don't need that. I know it so well that I can just talk just to you. I can connect just with you. And I think that comes back to this conversation of awkwardness. Embracing that awkwardness in those moments to where I may not have the perfect terminology. I may not be absolutely grammatically correct, but you know what I did do? I was real and I was connected. I wanted to, but I didn't. And so instead of stumbling and say, I can't do it because I might be awkward, you know what? That may happen. I'm going to try. I'm going to prepare so it doesn't, but yet I'm going to choose to be real and connect because that's what people want.
Right. And I think that is, the undoing of an old narrative. Like, I hate to, refer to like it as the Mad Men-esque era, but, back in the day, that was viewed as a sign of ineptitude. And so early in the book, I talk about, what awkwardness is, but what is it not? Awkwardness is not ineptitude. I use the analogy of, I would never hire an inept anesthesiologist, but I'd be perfectly fine hiring an awkward one. Right? Someone who's a little bit off, fine, no worries. It's not about ineptitude. You can still know your material. You can still be a master at what you do, and also find that the uncertainty of life, the unpredictability of the way someone responds, or the fact that they disagree with you, that's psychological flexibility. That's agility. And to embrace awkwardness, you have to have both. It can't be one or the other.
So one thought that I've had is, how much do people claim introversion as a way to avoid their awkwardness? Oh, I'm an introvert. I don't do that. I'm an introvert. I'm just going to hide over here.
Yeah. Often. And I think, what extroverts and introverts, they get unfairly put into boxes. I struggle a little bit with the introvert, extrovert, similar to, I love the Enneagram and things like that. But all of these things, I think they create limiting beliefs. They create identities. I am this, therefore that, so I always hesitate to let people use those excuses, myself amongst them. I have to, self-coach myself sometimes about the way I talk about my identity. Introversion in general, I think what I appreciate about the work of people like Susan Cain, right, who wrote Quiet and Bittersweet, is it's not that they feel awkwardness more. It's just they're much more in tune of how to process certain emotions, because introverts tend to be more naturally reflective, right? They need a little bit more of that time to process. And so what sometimes can be the danger for introverts is over processing the experience of awkwardness, right? Or potentially, again, going into the avoidance, because for introverts, it does take more energy to be in social situations. Awkwardness is tied to social situations very heavily. And because it takes just more energy to recharge the batteries after those. If an introvert was hammered with awkward situation after awkward situation, not only do they have to manage the energy of recharging their social battery in general, but then also the processing and recharge of those situations. So I think it's not any worse for them per se. It just depends how much energy they attach to that situation and whether it compounds to just the other social lift that it can sometimes take.
Yeah, and again, my thoughts are introverts tend to be more reserved, step away from situations, which would probably be a sign of awkwardness avoidance.
Sure.
Whereas
Can be,
extroverts,
yeah.
like, I'm going to dive into it. I'm just going to push through it, awkwardness, whatever, even if it is, like, I would say, not helpful in some of those situations. And that's where I wonder about this dynamic to say, okay, I'm awkward. Do I lean on, I'm just introverted because I'm more concerned about my awkwardness than I really just need time to process alone? And again, it becomes a crutch instead of like, I may need to process on my own, but I'm not going to use my awkwardness as an excuse. I actually need to embrace it. I need to push through it. I need to see the beauty in it and realize that's actually how I connect best with people because they think I'm real. And so I need to dive into it rather than, run from it.
Yeah, I think you nailed it when you said towards the end there, the real question is, does it lead to avoidance? Yeah. Right? If it leads to avoidance, then we need to reevaluate the role that your leaning on your introversion plays in your social growth and your professional risk taking. If it leads to avoidance, then we need to reevaluate. If it doesn't, and you're just someone who takes a little bit of extra time to yourself to process, but you still put yourself in that situation next time, all good. You can have your moments to recharge. You deserve those moments to recharge. I think really what it boils down to is, does it prevent? Does it create avoidance? If it does, then we need to have a new set of tools in the toolkit.
So someone has that. We talked about the conditioned person who is, avoids awkwardness. What's your best prescription? How do you guide someone through that?
Yeah, so there's a ton of tools I go through in the book, but I'll just give you a couple of my favorites. The first we sort of alluded to already. Name it. Name it. Like when there's an awkward situation, the thing that causes more agony, unnecessary agony, more discomfort than needed is the fact that we all just sit in it and, collectively are like, someone just say, well, this is awkward, right? Or woof, that's a cringe, right? The quicker someone can name it, it uses the slightest bit of humor, it diffuses the tension in the room, and people can move on, right? So just naming it is such a instant strategy that anybody can use, introvert, extrovert. The other thing that, really, and this is post-pandemic or, kind of in the moment in time we live in now that feels most acute, is every muscle, mental or physical, needs training, right? We need to train, we need to condition, we need to put in the reps, and mental muscles are no different than that. And something interesting that happened in the last few years is, you mentioned introverts. Introverts in general may not put themselves in as many situations that will help condition the mental muscle of embracing the awkward. But interestingly, in 2020 to 2022, even extroverts, we lost practice. Like our social muscles atrophied. We were home, we weren't having conversations. And so we also lost our ability to practice our reps, our muscles. So early in the book, I share a story about one of my very first in-person meetings back kind of once things opened up again. I was trying to pitch a client, kind of, sales hat was on. I was giving my best pitching. And the guy, I was standing across the room from him like this. He puts up his hand. And I'm like, I'm nailing it, right? So I give him a high five because I'm nailing it. And he goes, no, Henna, I was putting my hand up because I was trying to tell you to stop. And I was like, oh my God, right? Mortifying, so awkward, so embarrassing. And it was in that moment that I realized pre-pandemic Henna would have knew what that was. But post-pandemic Henna had kind of gotten out of practice. The social cues, the social, things we wait, physicality, like I kind of got out of practice with it. And so everybody can stand to condition these muscles. And some of the things you suggested already, how do we condition for awkward? We share embarrassing stories much more often at work. We share failure resumes, screw up stories. We role play, right? How do we create opportunities at work to build in day-to-day structures where embarrassment, cringe, awkwardness, discomfort is not just a byproduct, but is nearly guaranteed. I do team building activities where people do a new activity together that they've never done. No one is going to be good at it. No one's going to be good at it. And it is beautiful for helping embrace that feeling, creating connections, relationship satisfaction, all these other byproduct benefits. But we need to make it as much of a priority as we do nutrition and fitness, right? We just have to build it into our day.
So as I listened to that, as I processed that, and not going to give you an air high five because I get that. Actually,
you can. I need one
today.
After that.
Well, I was sharing this earlier today that I'm an extrovert and love being around people. And I found myself about a month ago, my wife and I went on a trip and I'm like, I don't want to go be around people. I'm like annoyed. Yeah, and what I had to quickly realize is like I've been too isolated where do my own little things, do Zooms here or there. I haven't done enough to just go sit in a coffee shop, go force myself to be around and engage and be excited about it. So when I go on a trip to be around people, I'm not irritated and I'm like, oh, I don't want to deal with it. I just want to go back to do what I'm doing because that's not the best of me. So I totally appreciate what you're saying there is we need to actually recondition ourselves and get back into those habits socially. And our world is yearning for it. The thing that I want to dig down deeper, though, is as you describe that, I take that as someone who's maybe not paralyzed by awkwardness. I'm thinking about, you mentioned the person that's been so deeply conditioned either by a parent, a spouse, another individual that their awkwardness is shameful. In other words, if they don't look the part, if they're not, you go back to, you're sharing your story as a young child, and here you are, you're, displaying yourself according to your family, whatever else, and it's everyone else is like, no, this doesn't fit. And so then that becomes a situation. If it perpetuates, you'll continue to go in situations where you don't stick out. And so if people that have been conditioned, their parents namely, who have said, if you are anything less than perfect, if you don't say every word perfect, then you have no reason to talk, or along those lines. And yet they're professionals. They're listening to this because they are in leadership roles. And yet they're so afraid of being considered awkward that it's paralyzing to them. How do you go deeper there?
Yeah. So, I'll peel back even one more layer, which is there is a distinction between awkwardness and clinical social anxiety, right? And so I want to make sure that we draw that there is a line between those two things. When we talk about awkwardness, we're not necessarily speaking to clinically diagnosed severe anxiety, which, some people do cross over to that point in which, clinical therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, these are people that are more equipped to handle those levels of anxiety. What I will speak to is the fact that when these things are so deeply ingrained, some of those tools that I just shared early on, we're not there yet. So there's some steps before the steps, which is doing a deep excavation and some unearthing about what are the historical patterns that we carry, right? And so some of the work I've done with people is to say, all right, if I were to speak up and I got it wrong, right, it landed flat, actually, have them walk it through to the end. Okay, I embarrassed myself. Let's look at fact here. What would be the consequence of that? Let's actually talk. What would be the consequence of that? What would be the worst that can happen from your social standing in the company, right? What is it actually? Not what do you think it is, not what's the emotional bear in your head, but what is it actually? What were the messages that you would have received if this happened when you were a child, right? If this was your mom or dad caregiver and not your boss, right? So we do need to dig layer into that kind of origin story for those emotions before we can even start tool application. But one of the strategies I do teach in the book about that is make downward adjustments. So if you're working on embracing the awkward, I am not going to suggest that if you have that level of, let's call it near paralysis around speaking up or putting yourself out there, then I do not suggest that your first attempt is raising your hand in the big meeting and trying something out, right? Much like at the Super Bowl, a player's not going to try his fancy new footwork for the first time, right? You don't do that. What's your downward adjustment? Is there a way that maybe that idea that you're sort of stewing on, could you bring it up to a trusted teammate in a smaller meeting setting? try that out just to hear the sound of your own voice, see how that lands. But you got to make downward adjustments. If you try to just aim big, then you're never going to be able to get there. So it's got to be incremental embracing. It's not going to be all at once. Yeah.
Start small where you can build momentum and build progress.
Yeah.
And actually get towards that. And understanding that, coming back to the beginning, if we embrace it, I believe this, once we embrace our awkwardness or once we embrace our uniqueness, so does everyone else.
Yeah.
I believe this, and kind of talk about awkwardness. Everyone's insecure. Every single person has insecurities. And we can embrace it and say, yes, that is something. Most people are like, yeah, I recognize it. I recognize when it came out. But yet then it's no longer something they can use against you. When you embrace your awkwardness, as I'm gathering here and I'm perceiving, once you embrace it, then other people can't use it against you because you're like, I already told you I am.
I know.
You have nothing over on me. Come on.
Yeah, it removes the power. Really, truly naming it removes the power from it, right? Owning it removes the power from it. And I think just one more nuance is, there's folks for whom it can feel more challenging than others. I also just feel it's important to address that not every environment, be it home or workplace, is a psychologically safe one, right? Still, I will just say, generally speaking, the data supports that for women, and especially women of color and under-recognized groups, there's still an expectation that workplace confidence translates to flawlessness. There is still an unfair double standard, again, substantiated by research, where for underrepresented groups, there's almost an expectation sometimes of an unfair, overly scrutinized level of flawlessness. Now, that's not every organization. Some organizations do a brilliant job of understanding the systems, but dip a toe in the water. Right? You don't just go guns blazing on embracing the awkward. Dip a toe in, feel out the safety, and then decide.
Someone listening in, I think the root of that is the CEO, much like you mentioned earlier, who was absolutely perfect, who everything was in line, totally starched, perfect. And then all of a sudden, a chink showed in his armor. And my guess is in that organization, that all of a sudden that expectation of everyone else, whether it was implied or actual, changed. A friend of mine has shared, I've talked about this before, the CEO, the executive of the future, is the one that raises their arms up and says, like, yep, I got sweaty pits. We're going to figure this out. No big deal. Compared to the guy that's like nothing, the woman who thinks that I need to show zero, fallibility at all in order to have authority here. Like, once we get past that, it actually gets easier for everyone else, because I believe absolutely what you're saying is right. And it shouldn't be that way, but it's driven by in order to be in a position of leadership or power, you have to be perfect. And if you're not dealing with whatever that perfect may be, then you can't get there, even though there is no perfect.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's changing, right? Like even what you've described about the, the white male CEO with the sweaty pits, there was a day where he couldn't have done that, so it's changing. But unfortunately, the systems are slow to change. And, for certain groups, it's still work in progress, for sure, every single day. And so, for folks that are like, I don't know if it's safe for me to, loudly admit my misstep at work. Well, I'm not here to throw you into the lion's den either. I think, slow dipping of the toe into the water. Is it safe to bring this up with some trusted teammates? Then maybe you can try to bring it up in the slightly bigger meeting. Then you can try to admit some of these, embarrassing moments in a slightly bigger meeting. But don't throw yourself out again into the lion's den without testing the psychological safety first.
What in your heart drives you the most to share this message?
That's a question that might make me cry. I was a child of immigrants with connected eyebrows who got made fun of mercilessly. I still remember my son's in 5th grade now and, having a tough time with a couple of kids. And I remember my mom had to come to the school when I was in 5th grade because this girl was so mean to me. And it was because I was different. It's because I had a different upbringing. I had a different style. I had a different way of being. And, it took me decades to find what I now refer to as my awkward confidence. That flawless, smooth, cool as a cucumber version of confidence. I kind of always say jokingly, she ain't ever coming for me. I don't know her. I snort when I laugh. I'm constantly tripping over myself. I'm cackling. Like, it's just that graceful version that I thought I aspired to is so out of reach. And I think the day that I discovered that there is a version that can exist that is simultaneously confident and awkward as hell, all of a sudden when I realized that version was something that I could aim towards, it feels like everything cracked wide open for me. So I think more than anything, I want to talk to those people that want a different version for themselves as well.
I love it. Love it. Henna, thank you so much. Thank you for being here with me.
Thank you.
Thank you for opening up. And I think it's a phenomenal discussion that in part of as we grow as leaders and the demand to be more authentic, we have to come to grips with these conversations. Because even if we accept and look at, say, oh, I don't understand why people don't embrace awkwardness. There's a lot of people that feel exactly like you did. And I wasn't much different. It was when you look at my last name, you could just go down the long list of things. I grew up in farm and varies the day. I mean, the long list of things. Yeah. I get it. Differently, but I get it.
No, listen, everyone has their thing. I don't think any of us are immune from it. Everyone has their thing. And so I hope that, anyone who's listening to this feels a little more emboldened to let some of their awkward edges show. Bumpy is beautiful. And, I appreciate the leaders that are doing the hard work to make it safe for others to let those edges show too.
Love it. Thank you. So there are 3 key points that I really want to hone in and focus in as we wrap up. The first one is awkwardness. As Henna described it, and she shared in the spheres that we're talking about, it's when someone feels or believe themselves, so their true self at a moment of odds. So whatever they believe of themselves and what their true self is, they're at a moment of odds. There's a gap between the person we believe ourselves to be and then the person who, for that moment, is on display, a person other people see. That's awkwardness in a moment. As I shared and kind of from my friend Roy Hall, founder of the Driven Foundation, he talks about failure being an event. Awkward is an event. Yeah, there's people that are awkward, sure. But they're awkward to people that don't get it. Other than that, awkward is an event. Henna shared about her events. The Phantom High Five, that was an awkward moment, right? Gladly say we all have awkward moments. And do we embrace them or do we hide from them? Do we avoid them? Do we try to shut down? The last one that I loved how she shared, awkwardness is not ineptitude. It's just part of life. What may be awkward to one isn't another. What's not to one another may be to someone else. But it doesn't mean ineptitude. This idea, and I appreciate her sharing so much, this differing in our world that, women of color or women, period, or whoever it may be, should be flawless. I don't get it. I don't understand it. It's not a frame of mind that I've ever been in. So I take from her and I appreciate it and I want to learn from it. But we shouldn't avoid that. Like awkward is a good thing. Because when we can be fascinated, as I've shared in previous episodes, man, we learn so much more about people. We deeper connect. Thanks for listening today. Another reminder, if you're not a subscriber to the weekly newsletter, the IDL, the Impact Driven Leader newsletter that I release each Friday, visit the impactdrivenleader.com/free course. There's also a link in your show notes to sign up for the newsletter. You also get access to my 4 days to maximum impact. Would love to have you as a part of the community, learn a little bit more, go deeper with us, maybe join one of the book clubs or roundtables on down the pathway. Thanks for being here today. Until next time, have a good one.